All right, guys, here we go. We're going to move on to our next topic of World War II, something called Operation Barbarossa. So, when we left off last time, we had finished up with the Battle of Britain, and I remember the key element of that battle was that Hitler tried to break the RAF, he tried to break the will of the British people, and he couldn't do either one. And after months and months of trying to conquer Britain, that didn't happen. And so eventually, what Hitler's going to do is turn his attention to Russia. And so I want to just briefly talk about this Operation Barbarossa. Again, there's a lot more detail to this than what I'm going to give you, but this is what I need you to know for the class. So here we have all the key words we need. And again, there's quite a bit to this particular conflict. And, there's why did Hitler do this? Why is Hitler going to invade Russia? By the way, it's called Operation Barbarossa because of a man named Frederick Barbarossa, who was a ruler of what was known as the Holy Roman Empire back around the year 1150. And, the idea was kind of a throwback to the Holy Roman Empire was that area of Germany and kind of this kind of throwback to that time period. That's why Hitler used that term. And why did he do this? Because he had a non-aggression pact with with Stalin. And then, there's a couple things. One issue is, of course, Hitler always had an eye on conquering more and more. One account I remember reading a few years back in some of the diaries of some German leaders was that the thought process was if they can break the Soviet Union, that way they would completely demoralize the British, and then he can go after the British again. So, at the end of the day, there was these different motivations, whether it was just his overarching power to try to take over more. There was also some idea that, the Soviets under Stalin were moving and encroaching into Romania, and that kind of sped up what Hitler was going to do regardless. But at the end of the day, he launches this massive campaign into Russia starting in June of 1941. And it's an 1,800-mile long front, as you can see on the graphic here on the map. This is, a very wide area that he's going to go into. And at first, Hitler moves very quickly. You can see all the area in blue here are areas that are occupied. Here's Moscow, folks. I mean, he's going to get pretty close to Moscow as he's going through this conflict. And in fact, there was something called Operation Typhoon in October, which was against Moscow. So Hitler is moving in very, very quickly, taking over a lot of land. Now, this is in June. So we go through June, July, August, September, October, and then we get to about November, December of 1941. And things change. What changes? Well, those of you who've studied a bit of history may recognize what's about to happen here. It gets cold. And as the Russian winter begins to come in, this really slows down Hitler's advancements. Stalin and, of course, the Soviets are much more comfortable fighting in this cold weather. And slowly, they're going to begin to push Hitler out. But it's going to take a long haul. And for people who studied history, if you think of back to my earlier lectures on Napoleon, right? The story of Napoleon is Napoleon tried to defeat the British, right? Specifically the British Navy at the time. Lord Nelson stopped him, and of course Napoleon ended up invading Russia. The winter hit, and he had to retreat really, really quick like, and that ended his power basically. In this case, all these years later, it was Hitler trying to break Britain. It wasn't the Navy. This time it was the Air Force that stopped him. And so Hitler then invades Russia, and the winter's going to hit, and this is going to hurt him as well. So, this is something that we've seen before in history, and it's going to happen again. And so the difference, of course, between Napoleon and the story of Hitler is when Napoleon invaded Russia and had to do this great retreat out of Russia, that was a pretty quick fall after him. Even after his invasion into Russia and after the winter, this is 1941, guys, there's still a long time left till World War II end. There's still years left because Hitler was so entrenched inside of Europe that, even though he lost at the Battle of Britain, and even though now the Soviets were pushing back, it's still going to take a long haul. A couple other quick things about this, or one other key point. In the city of Leningrad up here in the north, and I always just mention this just to give you a sense of the brutality associated with the fighting in Russia. In 1939, before all this starts, the city of Leningrad, as you can see, had a population of 3.5 million. By 1944, a population of 750,000. They weren't all killed. A lot of people were refugees. You know, there was tens of millions of people who became refugees as a result of World War II as well. But I use that statistic just to show you how, you know, brutal this war was. And the other thing I also mentioned for people who know about how Stalin fought, you know, this is very interesting because when Hitler invades Stalin, then all of a sudden Churchill and Stalin are allies. Now, this never makes Stalin a good guy, right? Stalin fought World War II with his philosophy of two men and one gun. The idea is he sends two people with one gun. If one person dies, they just pick up another guy, picks up a gun, and keeps going. And this has come up before, you know, how can you side, you know, how did Churchill side with Stalin? And, you know, this unfortunately is part of history. Very often, if you think of even modern history, we make allies with people who aren't always nice. And, you know, I think Churchill summarized this really best once when he said, if Hitler invaded hell, I'd have a few nice things to say about the devil. That at this moment, Churchill realized he had to work with the Soviet Union because it was a greater threat. Churchill never lost fact of the idea of the fact that Stalin was a horrible human being as well, opening up the gulags, murdering people by the millions as well. But he understood he needed to defeat Hitler. So with this, you know, Stalin's in the war, England's in the war, and then we also get to December of 1941. And again, for those people who even know the most basic of histories, something else is going to happen in December of 1941. The sleeping giant is going to awake. And of course, that is the United States, which will also be drawn into World War II after, of course, Pearl Harbor. And so that's going to be kind of the next big point we need to talk about, how the United States gets involved in the war, and then go from there. All right, so that's Operation Barbarossa. That's a little bit quick little story about that. Make sure you're familiar with those details. For those, of course, in my History 111 class, there's more detail in your textbook about some of the conflict in Russia, and so you have some of that you can look at as well. All right, thank you, everyone.